Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The relationship between my father and me could best be described as a series of absences, punctuated by brief, awkward reunions. Cal Morgan wasn't a bad man, far from it. He was simply the kind of father who existed more comfortably in letters and occasional phone calls than in the same room. My childhood memories of him were fragmented. A uniformed figure at the airport, returning from deployments I was too young to understand. A weathered face across the dinner table during holidays, speaking little while my mother filled the silence with gentle chatter. The sound of his truck pulling away before dawn, headed back to whatever remote corner of the world demanded his particular skills. He'd spent 23 years as an Army Ranger, earning commendations I never fully understood and scars he never explained. The places he'd been, Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, countries whose names he'd mentioned once and never again, had left marks deeper than the ones visible on his weathered skin. When he finally retired at 51, I'd hoped things might change. Instead, he'd simply traded one wilderness for another, taking a position teaching survival and wilderness navigation at a private training facility in Montana. My mother, God rest her, had loved him with a patience I never quite understood. She'd accepted his absences with grace, filling our home with warmth that somehow managed to stretch across continents. When the cancer took her in March 2022, it happened quickly, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Dad had made it home for the last 2 weeks, sitting beside her hospital bed with a helplessness that seemed to physically pain him. I'd never seen him cry, not even when they lowered her casket into the ground on that cold, rain-soaked morning. After the funeral, we'd become two planets in a decaying orbit, circling each other at a distance, connected by obligation and grief, but unable to close the gap. We spoke every few weeks, conversations that never lasted more than 10 minutes and rarely ventured beyond surface pleasantries. I'd built a life in Seattle, a decent job in marketing, a small apartment with a view of the Sound, a boyfriend who was kind but ultimately temporary. Dad remained in Montana, teaching young men and women how to survive situations most people would never encounter. The phone call came in early August 2025, on a Tuesday evening while I was halfway through a bottle of mediocre wine and a true crime documentary. His voice sounded different, softer somehow, carrying a vulnerability I'd never associated with Cal Morgan. "Rachel," he'd said after the briefest of greetings. "I was thinking, would you be interested in doing a trek with me? Wyoming, Wind River Range, week-long trip, just us." I'd almost said no. The excuses lined up easily in my mind. Work commitments, the cost of flights, my general lack of wilderness experience. But something in his voice stopped me, a quality I couldn't quite name but recognized as important. Maybe it was the memory of my mother's voice, urging me during one of our last conversations to give your father a chance, honey. He doesn't know how to ask for what he needs. "When?" I'd asked, and I could almost hear his surprise through the phone. "September, after Labor Day. Crowds thin out, weather's still decent." "Okay," I'd said, surprising myself. "Let's do it." The weeks leading up to the trip passed in a blur of preparation. Dad sent me detailed lists of required gear, patient explanations of what to expect, and links to conditioning exercises I should start doing. I bought boots I'd never worn before, broke them in on endless walks around Seattle's hills, and tried not to think too hard about spending 7 days in the backcountry with a man I barely knew despite sharing his DNA. I flew into Riverton on a Thursday morning, the first week of September. The landscape below shifted from the green wetness of the Pacific Northwest to the stark, beautiful emptiness of Wyoming. Endless plains broken by sudden mountain ranges, rivers cutting silver lines through ochre earth. Dad was waiting at the small airport, looking older than I remembered but still carrying himself with that particular military bearing that never quite fades. "You made it," he said, pulling me into a brief, awkward hug. "I made it," I confirmed, breathing in the familiar smell of his jacket, canvas and weathered leather, and something indefinably him. We drove northwest from Riverton in his battered Ford pickup, the truck rattling over increasingly rough roads as civilization fell away behind us. He pointed out features of the landscape, the Wind River itself, the distant peaks of the range, a golden eagle circling high above, while I tried to match his enthusiasm and failed. The silence between his observations felt heavy, filled with 3 years of things we hadn't said to each other. By late afternoon, we'd reached the Elkhart Park trailhead. Several other vehicles occupied the small parking area, their owners presumably already deep in the backcountry. A ranger station sat at the lot's edge, a small log structure with a covered porch. As we began organizing our gear, a ranger emerged. A woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. "Heading out tonight?" she asked, approaching our truck. "Tomorrow morning," Dad replied. "Thought we'd camp here, get an early start." She nodded approvingly. "Smart. We've had some bear activity this season. Grizzlies moving through, so hang your food properly. Also got reports of early snow at higher elevations. Weather can turn fast up there this time of year." "Understood," Dad said. "We're prepared." The ranger's eyes shifted to me, assessing. "First time in the winds?" "First time anywhere like this," I admitted. Her smile was encouraging. "You picked a beautiful area. Stay on marked trails, follow proper bear protocols, and you'll have an amazing experience." She paused, then added, "Radio if you run into any trouble. We do regular patrols, but response time can be slow depending on where you are." We spent the evening organizing our packs, Dad meticulously checking and rechecking equipment while I tried to memorize what went where. He'd brought a camp stove, and we ate a simple dinner of instant soup and crackers while the sun set behind the peaks, painting everything in shades of orange and purple. Other campers were scattered around the area, their voices carrying softly through the cooling air. "Your mother would have loved this,"
Dad said suddenly, staring into our small fire. "She always wanted to do something like this with me. I kept saying we would, someday, and then someday ran out."
It was the most personal thing he'd said to me in years. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. He squeezed back, and we sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Dawn came cold and clear, frost coating our tent and gear in delicate crystalline patterns. My body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, muscles protesting as I crawled out of my sleeping bag and into the frigid morning air. Dad was already up, moving with quiet efficiency as he heated water for coffee and instant oatmeal. The other campers were stirring as well, the peaceful morning broken by the sounds of zippers, muted conversations, and clanking cookware. We ate quickly, broke camp, and shouldered our packs by 7:30. The weight settled onto my shoulders like a physical accusation of my inexperience. 45 pounds of gear, food, and water that felt like it might crush me into the earth. Dad's pack was heavier, probably 60 pounds, but he wore it like it was part of his body. "We'll take it slow," he said, noticing my grimace. "First couple days are the hardest until your body adjusts. Let me know if you need breaks." The trail began gently enough, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. Morning light filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of gold and shadow across the path. Dad set a steady pace, not fast but relentless, and I focused on matching his rhythm, step after step, breathing carefully, trying not to think about the miles ahead. By mid-morning, the terrain had changed, becoming rockier and steeper. We climbed steadily upward, the trees thinning as we gained elevation. My legs burned, each step requiring conscious effort. Sweat soaked through my layers despite the cool temperature. Dad stopped periodically, ostensibly to check the map or adjust his pack, but I suspected it was more for my benefit. During these breaks, he'd point out features of the landscape, distant peaks, types of vegetation, animal tracks in the soft earth, speaking with an animation I rarely heard from him. "That's Fremont Peak," he said during one stop, indicating a massive granite summit dominating the horizon. 13,500 feet, second highest in the range. I stared at it, trying to comprehend that scale and failing. "Have you climbed it?" "3 times. Twice in summer, once in winter." He paused, then added, "Your mother came with me on the first summer climb. We weren't even married yet." This glimpse into their past surprised me. How was she with it? His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes, terrified and exhilarated. "She made me promise we'd do easier hikes after that," which we did for a while. The smile faded slightly, until I stopped making time for them. We continued climbing, the conversation falling away as the physical demands increased. By early afternoon, we crested a rise and Island Lake spread before us, a perfect alpine jewel reflecting the sky and surrounding peaks with mirror precision. Several other hikers were visible along its shores, tiny figures against the vast landscape. We stopped for lunch on a granite outcrop, eating trail mix and jerky while watching patterns of light and shadow move across the water as clouds drifted overhead. "How are you holding up?" Dad asked, studying my face. "Tired, sore, but okay." I hesitated, then added, "Thanks for being patient with me." "You're doing better than you think," he replied. "Most people would have quit by now. You've got more of me in you than you probably want to admit." It might have been the nicest thing he'd ever said to me. The afternoon brought new challenges, as we left Island Lake behind and climbed toward higher elevations. The trail became less defined, requiring careful navigation across boulder fields and steep slopes. My pack straps dug painfully into my shoulders, and blisters were forming on both heels despite my carefully broken-in boots. I focused on small goals. Reach that tree, make it to that rock. Just 20 more steps. Anything to avoid thinking about the total distance remaining. By the time we reached a suitable camping spot near Bonneville Basin, the sun was sinking toward the horizon and every muscle in my body was screaming. Dad chose a flat area near a small stream, protected from wind by a stand of twisted pines. We worked together to set up camp, the routine already becoming familiar. Tent first, then sleeping pads and bags, then organizing food and gear. Dad produced a small camp stove and began heating water while I collapsed onto a rock, peeling off my boots to examine the damage. The blisters were worse than I'd thought, angry red patches on both heels. "Let me see," Dad said, abandoning the stove. He examined my feet with practiced efficiency, then dug through his pack for a first aid kit. "Should have checked these at lunch. We'll clean them up, tape them properly. Should feel better tomorrow." His hands were gentle as he worked, applying antiseptic and carefully placing moleskin patches. It was strangely intimate, this care, and I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. When had he last tended to my injuries? I couldn't remember. Maybe when I was very young, before the deployments became constant. We ate dinner as darkness settled over the mountains. Freeze-dried meals that tasted better than they had any right to given my hunger. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, and we huddled close to our small fire, wrapped in down jackets. Above us, stars began appearing in astonishing numbers, the Milky Way visible as a brilliant smear across the sky. "I forget how dark it gets out here," I said softly. "City living ruins your night vision," Dad replied. "Takes a few days for your eyes to fully adjust. By the end of the week, you'll be able to navigate by starlight alone." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the stream's gentle gurgle and the occasional nightbird calling. I felt myself relaxing despite the physical exhaustion, some knot of tension I'd carried for years loosening slightly. This place, this vast wilderness, indifferent to human concerns, somehow made our strained relationship feel less important, less permanent. "Rachel," Dad said eventually, "I'm sorry I wasn't there more when you were growing up. Your mother, she deserved a partner who was actually present. You deserved a father who showed up." The words hung in the cold air between us. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice. "I told myself the work was important," he continued, "that I was serving a greater purpose, which maybe was true, but it was also easier than learning how to be a husband and father, easier than being vulnerable." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Your mother understood that about me, even if I didn't. She loved me anyway. I'll never understand why. She loved you because you were worth loving," I said quietly, "even if you didn't always make it easy." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm trying, Rachel. I know it's late, and I know I can't fix the past, but I'm trying." "I know," I whispered. "And this," I gestured at the wilderness around us. "This is good. This is a start." We talked late into the night, sharing stories and memories in a way we never had before. He told me about my mother when they first met, about his own childhood in rural Oregon, about the things he'd seen overseas that still haunted him. I told him about my life in Seattle, about my failed relationships, about feeling adrift in ways I'd never admitted to anyone. The fire burned down to coals, and still we talked, two people finally beginning to bridge a gap that had widened over decades. When we finally retreated to the tent, I felt exhausted but lighter somehow. as if I'd been carrying weight that had nothing to do with my physical pack. The third day dawned gray and cold, clouds hanging low over the peaks and promising weather that might turn unpleasant. My body had stiffened overnight, muscles protesting every movement as I emerged from the tent. Dad's ministrations to my blisters had helped, but new aches had appeared in places I didn't know could hurt. My lower back, my hip flexors, even my neck from the pack's weight. Storm might be coming, Dad observed, studying the sky while our breakfast water heated. Nothing serious yet, but we should keep an eye on it. If it turns bad, we'll hunker down early. We broke camp efficiently, the routine now familiar enough that we worked in synchronized silence. My pack felt marginally lighter today, though that might have been psychological. We'd eaten through several days of food, but I'd barely noticed the difference in weight. The trail that morning followed a ridgeline offering spectacular views across the basin. To our left, the land fell away in a series of rocky terraces toward distant valleys. To our right, peaks rose in jagged succession, their highest reaches already dusted with snow. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and coming weather, and I pulled my jacket tighter despite the warmth generated by hiking. Around mid-morning, as we traversed a section of dense lodgepole pine, Dad stopped abruptly. I nearly walked into him, catching myself at the last moment. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze into the forest. He didn't answer immediately, just stared intently at something I couldn't identify. Then he pointed. "Game trail. See how the vegetation's disturbed. Something's been using this route regularly." I squinted but couldn't see what he was seeing, just trees and undergrowth that all looked the same to me. "So?" I asked, trying to keep the impatience from my voice. My feet hurt, my shoulders hurt, and I wasn't particularly interested in whatever animal highway he'd spotted. "Just curious where it leads," he said, already adjusting his course. "Won't take long to check out." I sighed audibly, deliberately letting him hear my frustration, but he ignored it and stepped off the main trail. The game trail he followed was barely visible, a subtle pattern of compressed grass and broken twigs winding between the trees. I stayed close behind him, annoyed at the detour but not willing to argue. The forest grew denser as we pushed deeper, pine branches scraping against our packs and jackets. Sunlight barely penetrated here, creating a perpetual twilight that felt oppressive. The temperature seemed to drop, though that might have been my imagination. Something about the silence in this grove felt wrong. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of our breathing and footsteps. After maybe a quarter mile, the game trail opened into a small clearing. My father stopped so suddenly. I bumped into his pack. Then I saw what had frozen him in place, and my stomach twisted violently. The structure before us defied easy description. Calling it a shelter seemed inadequate, even generous. It was something between a crude dwelling and a monument to insanity, built against a rocky slope where the forest thinned and the mountain's bones showed through. The walls, if they could be called that, were constructed from elk antlers interwoven with branches, and what I initially thought were more weathered wood pieces. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimness and my brain processed what I was seeing, the truth revealed itself in nauseating clarity. Those weren't all branches, they were bones. Large bones, leg bones probably, from deer or elk, their surfaces scoured clean and bleached by exposure. They'd been deliberately arranged, stacked and wedged between the antlers to create a skeletal framework. The structure stood perhaps 7 feet tall at its highest point, leaning back against the slope as if the mountain itself was slowly swallowing it. The roof, if the tangled mess of branches and what looked like animal hides could be called a roof, sagged in the middle, creating a dark opening that led to whatever interior space existed. Everything about it spoke of age and decay. The antlers were cracked, the bones porous and brittle-looking, the wood gray and rotting. But it was the details that made my nausea rise into actual fear. Many of the bones showed clear marks of gnawing, deep grooves and scratches where something had worried at them, extracting marrow or simply wearing the surface down. The pattern of damage was extensive, methodical, covering nearly every exposed surface. And the smell, God, the smell that emanated from the structure was indescribable. Rot and old death and something else. Something acrid that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. "Dad?" I managed to whisper, my throat tight. "What is this?" He didn't answer. He'd moved closer to the structure, approaching it with the careful precision he might use near an unexploded device. He knelt beside one of the main support beams, a thick piece of weathered timber that seemed to anchor the entire mad construction. His hand reached out, fingers hovering just above the surface. Then he jerked back as if burned, face draining of color. "Dad," I said again, louder this time, my own feet carrying me forward despite every instinct screaming to run. He gestured for me to look, pointing at the beam. I leaned in reluctantly, squinting at the gray wood, not understanding what had so disturbed him. Then I saw them. Teeth. Human teeth, embedded directly into the wood. Not placed on top or hung like grotesque decorations, but forced into the grain itself with such violence that the roots were visible, ivory white fading to sickly yellow. They'd been hammered or pressed into the timber with enough force to split the wood around them, creating starburst patterns of cracks. I counted 8 of them on this beam alone, arranged in no pattern I could discern, just scattered across the surface like obscene punctuation. My hand flew to my mouth, pressing against my lips to hold back the vomit threatening to rise. The world tilted slightly, adrenaline flooding my system with its metallic taste. "We need to go," I said, my voice high and thin. "Dad, please, we shouldn't be here." For a long moment he didn't respond, just stared at the embedded teeth with an expression I'd never seen on his face. Something between horror and grim recognition, as if he'd found confirmation of a terrible suspicion. Finally he nodded once, sharply. Without a word, he turned away from the structure and began walking back the way we'd come. His pace was faster than before, just short of running, and I hurried after him, glancing back only once at that terrible shelter. In the brief moment my eyes lingered on it. I could swear I saw something moving in the dark opening that served as its entrance. A shifting of shadows, a suggestion of presence. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. Just darkness and the faint smell of decay drifting through the cold air. We pushed through the forest in tense silence, branches whipping at our faces and gear. My heart hammered against my ribs, each sound making me flinch. Every snap of twigs, every rustle that might be footsteps following behind us. Dad led us back to the main trail with navigational precision that suggested he'd been tracking our route carefully despite his focus on the game trail. When we finally broke through to the established path, both of us stopped, breathing hard, and looked at each other. His face was still pale, jaw tight, eyes scanning the forest behind us, as if expecting pursuit. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Dad, what the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," he said quietly, but his eyes told a different story. He knew something, or suspected something, that he wasn't ready to share. "Those were human teeth," I said, needing him to acknowledge it. "Someone put human teeth into that wood. Someone built that thing." "I know. So what do? We report it, right? We tell the rangers?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "We will. But first we need to put some distance between us and that place. We'll move down to lower elevation, somewhere with better sight lines. Then we'll figure out our next steps." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't the whole truth, but I was too shaken to press him. We started hiking again, moving faster than our previous pace. Dad led us down a steep slope toward the sound of running water, a glacial stream cutting through the valley below. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks and sudden drops requiring careful footing, but the danger felt welcome compared to whatever we'd left behind in that grove. By early afternoon, we'd descended several hundred feet and found a spot near the stream where the land flattened slightly. Dad surveyed the area with military thoroughness before declaring it acceptable. Unlike our previous camps, which had been nestled in protective tree cover, this spot was open, offering clear views in multiple directions. We set up camp in near silence, both of us working with unusual speed. I couldn't shake the feeling of exposure, as if invisible eyes were tracking our movements from the forest above. Every time I glanced up at the ridgeline we descended from, I half expected to see a figure watching us. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. Dad busied himself with camp tasks that seemed unnecessary, reinforcing tent stakes, reorganizing gear, cleaning equipment that didn't need cleaning. I recognized it as displacement activity, keeping his hands busy while his mind worked on problems he hadn't shared with me. As dusk approached and the temperature dropped, he finally built a fire. We sat beside it, neither of us with much appetite despite our exertion. The flames danced and crackled, creating a small sphere of light and warmth in the gathering darkness. "Dad," I said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "You know something about that place, I can tell. What is it?" He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the stream's constant rush. When I was teaching survival courses, we'd sometimes get reports. Strange things found in remote areas. Structures that didn't make sense. Evidence of camps that seemed wrong somehow. Most of it was easily explained. Homeless people living off-grid, preppers setting up hideaways, even art installations that got abandoned. He paused, jaw working. But some of them were different. Wrong in ways that defied explanation. "What kind of wrong?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The kind that made experienced woodsmen refuse to go back to certain areas. The kind that led to people disappearing. He looked at me directly, his eyes reflecting firelight. 6 years ago, a friend of mine from my old unit vanished up here. Name was Bill Navarro. He'd come out for a solo trek. Experienced as hell. Knew these mountains like his own backyard. 3 days in, he missed a scheduled check-in. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks combing every trail within 50 miles. They found nothing. No gear. No signs of struggle. Nothing. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You think what we found is connected?" "I don't know," he admitted. But Bill wasn't the only one. Over the past 15 years, 4 soldiers from my old unit have vanished in these mountains. All experienced outdoorsmen. All on solo trips. The official explanation is always the same. Tragic accidents, falls, exposure. But none of the bodies were ever recovered. The fire crackled between us, and I found myself scanning the darkness beyond its light, seeing threats in every shadow. "Why didn't you tell me this before we came out here?" I asked, anger creeping into my voice. "Because I didn't think." He trailed off, then started again. "I've been coming to these mountains for years, Rachel. Never had any problems. I thought the disappearances were just coincidence. Tragic but explainable. I didn't actually believe there was something out here." He gestured vaguely toward the ridge above us. "Not until we found that shelter." We sat in tense silence as full darkness descended. The stream's rush seemed louder now, masking other sounds that might have warned us of approaching danger. Every snap of burning wood made me jump. My father kept the fire built high, feeding it constantly, creating a perimeter of light around our small camp. As the night deepened, I found myself thinking about that structure, about the teeth embedded in wood, about the gnawed bones and the smell of decay, about what kind of mind or minds would build such a thing. And more terrifying still, about whether whatever had built it was still out there, watching us from the darkness beyond the firelight. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did my father. We took turns keeping watch, though neither of us ever truly rested. And when the footsteps began sometime after midnight, slow, deliberate circling just beyond our fire's glow, we simply sat frozen, listening, as something studied us from the safety of shadows. When you spend enough time alone in the wilderness, you learn the difference between ordinary silence and the kind of quiet that warns you something's wrong. It's a silence that settles over you slowly, like fog creeping through a valley. The kind you don't notice until you realize you've stopped breathing just to hear better. The birds stop singing first. Then the insects fall quiet. Finally, even the wind seems to hold back, leaving you wrapped in a suffocating blanket of stillness. My name's Jason Weller, and 2 years ago I resigned as a backcountry ranger at Zion National Park after an accident that left 3 hikers dead, and me with scars that run deeper than skin. These days I earn a living writing about solitude in wild places. Authentic, unfiltered, and completely analog. No GPS, no cameras, no electronics. Just maps, journals, and the kind of intuition that only comes from years of reading the land. This time, my assignment was to document the Grand View Trail on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The editor at Wilderness Quarterly wanted something raw, something that captured the essence of isolation in one of America's most visited yet paradoxically empty places. It was late November, well past the tourist season, when the canyon transforms from a crowded viewpoint into something primordial and threatening. The morning I arrived, frost covered the parking area. My breath came out in white clouds as I adjusted my pack. checking and rechecking the weight distribution. 42 pounds of gear, food for 5 days, and enough water to get me to the first reliable spring. The wooden trailhead sign, weathered gray and split down the middle, bore a warning that had been carved deeper by some previous hiker. Unmaintained path. Proceed with caution. Below that, someone had scratched. They watch from below. I'd seen worse graffiti, ignored worse warnings. The Grandview Trail drops fast, faster than any maintained trail in the park system. Within the first mile, you lose 1,000 feet of elevation through switchbacks so tight they double back on themselves like a serpent's coils. The path, if you can call it that, consists of loose shale over hardpack, every step a calculated risk. One wrong foot placement sends cascades of rock tumbling into the void, the sound echoing for seconds before fading into nothing. By sunset, I'd made it down to Horseshoe Mesa, a relatively flat expanse of red rock that juts out from the canyon wall like a broken tooth. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees during my descent, and my sweat-soaked shirt now felt like ice against my skin. I picked a campsite close to a rust-colored rock wall, using its bulk to block the wind that howled up from the depths below. Camp came together with practiced efficiency. Tent staked at precise angles to shed any unexpected rain. Sleeping bag unrolled inside. Positioned to catch the first light of dawn. Stove assembled and tested. The blue flame hissing reassuringly before I shut it off to conserve fuel. My leather gloves, worn soft from years of use, I placed carefully beside my pack. As darkness fell, the canyon transformed. What had been grand vistas became yawning voids of blackness. The stars emerged with violent brightness, but their light couldn't penetrate the depths below. I ate mechanically, freeze-dried pasta that tasted like cardboard despite the Italian herb label, while updating my journal. Day 1. Made good time to Horseshoe Mesa. No other hikers encountered. Canyon unusually quiet, even for November. Something feels different about this place. Can't put my finger on it. The silence has weight here. Exhaustion pulled me under before I'd even capped my pen. I woke at 2:15 a.m. According to my watch's luminous dial, my sleeping bag was damp with condensation, and for a moment I thought that's what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not the quick snuffling breath of a curious animal. This was slow, deliberate, almost contemplative. Each inhale lasted 4 seconds. Each exhale, 5. The rhythm was hypnotic, terrifyingly human. The sound came from just beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent, close enough that I could hear the subtle wheeze at the end of each breath. My hand found the handle of my knife, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip. The breathing continued, patient and measured. I counted 23 breaths before it stopped, cutting off mid-exhale as if someone had simply decided to stop breathing. Dawn arrived pale and hesitant, the sun's first rays struggling to warm the frost-covered rocks. I emerged from my tent slowly, knife still in hand, scanning the campsite. What I saw made my stomach turn to lead. My fuel canister, which I had carefully screwed onto my stove the night before, now sat neatly atop a flat rock 3 feet away. The stove itself remained where I'd left it, but the canister had been unscrewed with deliberate care. My map, which I distinctly remembered folding and placing inside my tent near my boots, was now tucked under my sleeping pad, visible through the tent's mesh window. The corners were aligned perfectly, as if someone had used a ruler. Most disturbing of all, my extra socks, which had been stuffed deep in my pack, were now folded into perfect squares and placed side by side on top of the pack's main compartment. The precision was unsettling, obsessive. I searched the dust around my campsite for tracks, spending 20 minutes on my hands and knees examining every disturbance. The ground was too rocky, too windswept to hold clear prints, but there were subtle signs, scuff marks that didn't match my boot pattern, a partial heel print near where the fuel canister had been placed. The print was human but wrong, too long, too narrow, as if someone with impossibly thin feet had stood there. The canyon walls loomed around me, and for the first time, I understood why ancient peoples believed these places were haunted. There's a quality to the silence here that feels watchful, anticipatory. I wrote quickly in my journal, my handwriting shakier than usual. This doesn't feel like my camp. Someone was here. Someone is still here, watching. The breathing. God, I can still hear it in my head. Need to stay alert. Need to keep moving. By midday, I'd covered another 3 miles of treacherous descent, following the trail as it wound deeper into the canyon's gullet. The path clung to cliff sides, offering spectacular views that I barely noticed. My attention was focused on the persistent feeling of being observed. It wasn't constant, more like waves washing over me, moments of acute awareness that made me spin around, searching the rocks above and below. I stopped on an exposed ledge to drink water and check my position. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat stung my eyes as I unfolded my map. That's when I saw the figure. On a narrow shelf roughly 400 feet away, across a gap that dropped into darkness, stood a person. The distance made details impossible, but the shape was unmistakably human. Tall, unnaturally thin, standing with perfect stillness. Not the casual stance of another hiker taking in the view, but rigid, deliberate immobility. I raised my hand in greeting, the universal gesture of acknowledgement between backcountry travelers. The figure didn't respond. I waited, hands still raised, feeling increasingly foolish and exposed. Then, as I began to lower my arm, the figure moved. It raised its hand exactly as I had, but the motion was wrong, delayed by perhaps 2 seconds, and mechanical, like someone following instructions they didn't quite understand. My mouth went dry. I tilted my head left, a subtle test. 2 seconds later, the figure's head tilted left. I stepped backward. 2 seconds later, it stepped backward. Terror isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's a slow realization that builds like pressure in your chest. I backed away until the cliff face hid the figure from view, then stood there for 5 minutes, working up the courage to look again. When I finally peered around the rock, the shelf was empty, but when I reached that section of trail an hour later, fresh boot prints marked the dust. The prints were human in shape, but stretched out, as if someone had drawn a normal footprint and then extended it by several inches. That night I chose my campsite with paranoid care. A shallow ravine offered walls on 3 sides, limiting approaches. I arranged rocks around the perimeter, not for any real protection, but because the action gave me something to focus on besides the growing certainty that I was being stalked. My bear bag went up higher than necessary, tied with redundant knots. Sleep felt dangerous, but exhaustion has a way of overcoming fear. I dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound. The wind had died completely, leaving the canyon in absolute silence. Even my own breathing seemed too loud. At exactly 12:40 a.m., I remember, because I checked my watch with obsessive frequency, footsteps approached through the gravel, not the irregular gait of an animal, or the quick steps of someone with purpose. These were measured, thoughtful steps, each one placed with deliberate care. They stopped perhaps 10 feet from my tent. The silence stretched out, broken only by my hammering heartbeat. Then a voice spoke, low, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. My voice, but hollow, drained of everything that makes speech human. "Stay awake," it said. "Stay awake." Nausea rolled through me in waves. Sweat soaked through my sleeping bag despite the cold. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to confront whatever stood outside. But some deeper wisdom, some primitive understanding, kept me frozen. To see it would be to acknowledge it. To acknowledge it would be to invite it closer. Instead, I fumbled in the darkness for my journal, gripping the pen so tightly my fingers cramped. I wrote blindly, the same words over and over. It's not me, it's not me, it's not me. The presence outside didn't speak again. It simply waited, patient as stone. I lay there for hours, muscles locked in terror, until the first hint of dawn finally lightened the tent fabric. When I finally emerged, my boots were gone. They had been placed carefully at the tent entrance. Laces loosened for easy access in the morning. Now only shallow depressions in the dirt marked where they'd been. My bear bag hung untouched, swaying gently in the morning breeze. But beneath it, arranged with disturbing precision, was a circle of ash and small stones. Inside the circle lay my journal, closed and positioned exactly in the center. My hands shook as I picked it up, remembering the frantic writing from the night before. I opened it to the last entry. The page was blank, not torn out, not erased. The paper showed no signs of ever having been written on. I flipped back through previous pages. All my entries were there except for last night's desperate scrawling. Without boots, my options were limited and grim. I duct-taped sections of my foam sleeping pad to my feet, creating makeshift protection that would last maybe a mile on this terrain. The alternative was to stay put and wait for whatever had taken my boots to return. That wasn't an alternative at all. I packed with fumbling urgency, the morning cold making my fingers clumsy. Every few seconds I glanced around the ravine, expecting to see that thin figure watching from the rocks above. The canyon felt different now, not just watched but actively hostile, as if the very stones resented my presence. The improvised footwear lasted less than an hour. Sharp rocks and coarse gravel shredded the foam, leaving my feet increasingly exposed. Each step became a calculation of pain versus progress. Blood began seeping through the duct tape, leaving dark stains on the pale rock. To keep myself moving, I started talking aloud. Simple encouragements, the kind you'd give a frightened child. "Just keep moving, Jason. One step, then another. You're doing fine." A voice answered from the switchback above, precise in its mimicry, but empty of understanding. "One step, then another. You're doing fine." I stopped so abruptly I nearly fell. Looking up at the trail above, I saw only empty rock and scattered juniper. My throat felt lined with sandpaper as I called out, "Who's there?" The response came immediately, from a different direction this time, somewhere off to my left. "Who's there?" My voice, but stripped of fear, curiosity, humanity. It was like hearing a recording of myself played through broken speakers. Panic overwhelmed strategy. I ran, or tried to, my destroyed makeshift shoes providing no purchase on the loose rock. I fell repeatedly, palms and knees taking the damage my feet couldn't absorb. Behind me, or above, or sometimes seeming to come from the very air around me, my own voice followed, repeating fragments of my gasps and cries. Near the rim, delirium and exhaustion blurred together. The trail seemed to stretch and contract with each labored breath. My feet had gone numb, which was a mercy, though I could see the blood trail I was leaving. Just a few more switchbacks. Just a few more. Movement caught my eye. A dark shape beside a gnarled juniper. I turned, expecting another hallucination brought on by pain and fear. But the figure that rose from its crouch was real enough. Impossibly thin, draped in what might have once been clothing but now looked more like strips of weathered leather. And on its feet, impossibly clean and carefully laced, were my boots. It stood slowly, unfolding upward like a praying mantis rising from ambush. No face was visible in the shadow of its coverings, but I felt its attention like cold fingers on my spine. It tilted its head, matching the angle of my own terrified gaze. One step forward. I scrambled backward. Another step. I turned and ran. The last 100 yards exist in my memory as fragments. Crawling on all fours up a particularly steep section. The taste of blood in my mouth from breathing too hard. The impossible sight of the parking lot appearing like a mirage. The green SUV with the National Park Service insignia. I collapsed beside the vehicle, chest heaving, vision spinning. Gravel bit into my palms as I tried to steady myself. Footsteps approached, normal, human footsteps. A ranger's boots entered my field of view. "Easy now," he said, voice professionally calm. "You're all right." I looked up at him, trying to form words through cracked lips. It wore my voice. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition. He helped me to my feet with practiced gentleness, guiding me to the vehicle's rear door. As I collapsed onto the seat, he stood for a moment looking out toward the canyon's depths. When he turned back, his voice carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. "You're not the first." He closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. As we pulled away, I turned to look back at the trailhead. For just a moment, I thought I saw a thin figure standing at the rim, watching. Then the road curved, and it was gone. The ranger drove in silence for several minutes before speaking again. "There are things in the canyon that have been there longer than the parks, longer than the roads. Most people never notice them, but sometimes," he glanced at me in the rearview mirror, "sometimes they notice us." I spent 3 days in the hospital, my feet wrapped in bandages, my story dismissed as dehydration-induced hallucinations. But the ranger, his name was Samuel Ortiz, visited me before I was discharged. He brought my journal, recovered from my abandoned pack. Inside, pressed between the pages where my frantic writing should have been, was a single crow feather. "Keep that," he said. "And Jason, find somewhere else to write about." I took his advice. These days, I stick to well-traveled trails and popular destinations. But on quiet nights when the wind dies and silence settles heavy around my apartment, I sometimes hear it again. That breathing. Patient, measured, waiting. And sometimes, though I try not to listen too carefully, I hear my own voice calling from somewhere outside my window. Stay awake, stay awake. I always do. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as I guided my park ranger truck along the dusty trails of Chiricahua National Monument. It was June 17, 1991, and at 28 years old, I thought I'd seen just about everything 5 years as a ranger could throw at me. My name's Kevin Romer, and I was about to discover how wrong I was. The day started like any other, a routine patrol to ensure hikers weren't getting lost or breaking park rules. Honestly, it was mostly an excuse to soak in the raw beauty of the desert landscape. Chiricahua is something else. A maze of cactus-studded ridges and jagged rock formations that can mesmerize you if you're not careful. It's the kind of place where the line between awe and danger blurs easily. As I navigated the winding dirt roads, my radio crackled to life. It was Jenny from Dispatch, her voice tinged with mild concern. "Kevin, we've got reports of unauthorized camping in Sector 7. Can you check it out?" I frowned. Sector 7 was off limits due to unstable ground conditions. We'd had problems with thrill seekers ignoring the warnings before, but it had been quiet for months. "Copy that, Jenny. I'm on my way. Probably just some kids thinking they're invincible. Be careful out there, Kevin. Something feels off about this one." I brushed off her concern with a chuckle. But as I turned the truck towards Sector 7, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The desert seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the midday heat, but the feeling persisted. As I approached the restricted area, the terrain became more rugged. The truck bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, forcing me to slow to a crawl. Finally, I reached a point where I couldn't go any further by vehicle. Grabbing my pack and radio, I set out on foot. The sun was directly overhead now, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Sweat trickled down my back as I pushed through the scrub brush, my eyes scanning for any sign of the reported campers. That's when the smell hit me. If you've ever encountered a dead animal that's been baking in the desert sun for days, you know the stench I'm talking about. It's a thick, cloying odor that seems to coat your nostrils and cling to the back of your throat. But this was different, stronger, more pungent, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach churn. I've smelled death before. It's an unfortunate part of the job sometimes. But this was on another level entirely. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to radio for backup, to do anything but continue towards that hellish odor. But duty, and a morbid curiosity I'm not proud of, drove me forward. As I crested a small rise, I saw it. A clearing that had been turned into a campsite. Or rather, what was left of a campsite. The scene before me was one of utter devastation. 2 tents lay in tatters, shredded as if by enormous claws. A cold fire pit sat in the center, untouched for at least a day or more. Camping gear was strewn about haphazardly, some items bent and twisted beyond recognition. But it was the blood that caught and held my horrified gaze. Dark red stains splattered the ground, smeared across the remnants of the tents, even speckled on the surrounding rocks. It looked like someone or something had painted the campsite with gore. My hand shook as I reached for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Romer. I've found the campsite in Sector 7. It's bad. Really bad. I need backup and forensics out here immediately." Jenny's voice came back tight with tension. "Copy that, Kevin. What exactly are we dealing with?" I swallowed hard, my eyes still roaming the nightmarish scene before me. "I'm not sure. There's blood everywhere, but no bodies that I can see. The campsite's been torn apart. It looks like some kind of animal attack, but I've never seen anything like this." "Understood. Stay put, Kevin. Backup's on the way. And be careful. Whatever did this might still be in the area." As I lowered the radio, a chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat. Jenny was right. Whatever had wreaked this havoc could still be nearby, and judging by the destruction around me, It was something far more dangerous than any wildlife I'd encountered before. I drew my sidearm, a standard issue Glock that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. The silence that had seemed eerie before now felt positively malevolent. Every rustle of wind through the scrub brush, every shifting pebble sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Keeping my weapon at the ready, I began a cautious circuit of the clearing, looking for any clues as to what had happened here. That's when I saw it, a trail of disturbed earth and blood leading away from the campsite. Every instinct told me to stay put and wait for backup, but if there was even a chance that one of the campers had survived and managed to escape, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. With a deep breath to steel my nerves, I began to follow the grisly trail. As I moved deeper into the wilderness, leaving the relative safety of the clearing behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and more than once I whirled around, certain I'd caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. But each time, there was nothing there. Just rocks, cacti, and the ever-present oppressive heat. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. Whatever had attacked the campsite wasn't gone. It was out there, watching, waiting, and I was walking right into its territory. The trail of blood and disturbed earth led me deeper into one of the most remote areas of Chiricahua National Monument. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, with narrow paths winding between towering rock formations and deep, shadowy crevices. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. I moved as quietly as I could, my senses on high alert. Every snapping twig under my boots, every pebble sent skittering down a slope, sounded thunderous in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the desert. The usual sounds of wildlife, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of a lizard through the underbrush, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trail I was following became more erratic, zigging and zagging between rock outcroppings. In some places it disappeared entirely, forcing me to search for subtle signs. A scuff mark here, a broken branch there, to stay on track. Whatever had left this trail was moving with purpose, but also seemed to be struggling. The spacing of the marks was irregular, as if the creature or person was limping or dragging itself along. As I rounded a large boulder, I froze. There, not 20 feet away, was a sight that turned my blood to ice. It was a body, or what was left of one. The remains were so mangled and torn that I couldn't immediately tell if it was male or female. Limbs were twisted at impossible angles, the torso ripped open as if by some monstrous force. The face, I tried not to look at the face, but the image seared itself into my brain. Eyes wide with terror, mouth frozen in a silent scream. I've seen my fair share of animal attacks in my years as a ranger, but this was something else entirely. No mountain lion or bear could have done this kind of damage. The body looked like it had been mauled by something with the strength of a grizzly, but the ferocity of a rabid wolverine. Fighting back the urge to vomit, I reached for my radio with trembling hands. "Dispatch, this is Romer. I've found a body. It's bad. Really bad. Send everything you've got, and tell them to be careful. Whatever did this, it's not like anything we've dealt with before." Jenny's voice came back, tight with tension. "Copy that, Kevin. Backup is en route. ETA 20 minutes. Kevin, maybe you should fall back and wait for them." I was about to agree when something caught my eye. There, leading away from the grisly scene, was another trail. This one was fresher, the blood still glistening wetly in the fading sunlight, and mixed in with the blood were strange, alien-looking tracks. They were vaguely feline in shape, but far too large, with odd protrusions that looked almost like fingers. "Negative, dispatch," I heard myself say, even as my mind screamed at me to turn back. There might be another victim out there. I'm going to follow the trail a bit further. I'll be careful, I promise. Kevin, don't. Jenny's protest was cut off as I switched off the radio. I couldn't explain it, but something was driving me forward. A mix of duty, curiosity, and a growing irrational need to understand what was happening in my park. As I followed the new trail, the terrain became even more challenging. I found myself squeezing through narrow gaps between towering rock walls, the stone still radiating the day's heat. The shadows grew longer, deeper, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon. Soon I knew. The desert night would fall. bringing with it a bone-deep chill and dangers I didn't want to contemplate. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the desert. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite. Something else. The sound raised every hair on my body and sent a primal jolt of fear through my system. Instinctively, I ducked behind a large boulder, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. Peering cautiously around the rock, I saw movement in a small clearing ahead. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was like trying to comprehend a Salvador Dali painting come to life. The creature, and I use that term loosely, was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to anything I recognized ended. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its body a twisted mass of sinewy muscle and what looked like chitinous plates. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, ending in hands, if you could call them that, tipped with wicked curved claws. But it was the head that truly defied description. Elongated and eyeless, it ended in a mouth that split open vertically, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. As I watched, frozen in terror, a long whip-like tongue snaked out, tasting the air. The creature moved with a fluid grace that belied its monstrous appearance, circling something on the ground. With a start, I realized it was another body, but this one was moving weakly. Someone was still alive out there. In that moment, I had a choice to make. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But I knew I couldn't leave a survivor to face this horror alone. With shaking hands, I raised my Glock and took aim. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The creature's head snapped up, that eyeless face turning in my direction with terrifying speed. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, with a shriek that would haunt my dreams for years to come, it charged. I fired again and again, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the grotesque form bearing down on me. But the bullet seemed to have little effect, merely enraging the beast further. In the span of seconds, it closed the distance between us, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I dove to the side just as it reached me, feeling the wind of its passage and the sting of its claws as they grazed my arm. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Gasping for breath, I rolled, bringing the Glock up for another shot. But the creature was already on me. A clawed hand smashed the gun from my grip, sending it skittering across the rocky ground. Another blow caught me in the chest, lifting me off my feet and slamming me against the canyon wall. Stars exploded in my vision as my head cracked against the stone. Through the haze of pain, I saw the creature looming over me, its mouth opening impossibly wide. The stench of rotting meat washed over me as it leaned in, that nightmare tongue flicking out to taste my fear. This was it, I thought. This was how Kevin Romer, park ranger, was going to die. Torn apart by something that shouldn't exist in a godforsaken corner of the Arizona desert. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But it never came. Instead, a new sound split the air. A high, keening wail that set my teeth on edge. The creature reared back, its head swiveling towards the source of the noise. Without warning, it bounded away, disappearing into the gathering darkness with inhuman speed. I lay there for what felt like hours, my body battered, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. Eventually, the sound of approaching voices and flashlight beams cut through the fog of pain and fear. Backup had finally arrived. As I was loaded into a waiting ambulance, I caught a glimpse of something that chilled me to my core. There, on a nearby rock face, illuminated by the harsh glare of floodlights, was a marking. It looked ancient, weathered by centuries of wind and sand, but its form was unmistakable, a crude representation of the creature I had just encountered. Whatever this thing was, it had been here for a long, long time, and I had a sinking feeling that our troubles were just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital rooms, police interviews, and sleepless nights plagued by vivid nightmares. My physical injuries were relatively minor, some cuts, bruises, and a mild concussion, but the psychological trauma ran deep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its eyeless face looming over me, jaws wide and ready to strike. The official investigation into the incident was a joke. Despite the evidence, the mangled bodies, the strange tracks, my own testimony, the authorities seemed determined to write it off as a tragic animal attack. Mountain lion, they said. Maybe a particularly aggressive bear. When I tried to describe what I'd seen, the looks I received ranged from pity to outright disbelief. Listen, Romer, Sheriff Dawson said, his voice a mixture of concern and condescension. I know you've been through a hell of an ordeal, but what you're describing, it's impossible. There's no such thing as monsters. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand that what I'd encountered was very real and very dangerous. But I bit my tongue. I was already being looked at like I was one bad day away from a padded room. Pushing the issue would only make things worse. Instead, I focused on the one person who seemed to take me seriously. Dr. Elena Valdez, a cryptozoologist who had somehow caught wind of the incident and managed to wrangle her way into the investigation. She listened to my story without judgment, her dark eyes intense as she took copious notes. "What you're describing, Mr. Romer," she said after I'd finished recounting my experience for what felt like the 100th time, "bears some similarities to creatures from Native American folklore. The Tohono O'odham people, who have lived in this region for centuries, have stories of shape-shifting beings that dwell in remote areas. They're said to be ancient, powerful, and incredibly dangerous." I latched onto her words like a drowning man grasping at a lifeline. "So you believe me? You think this thing is real?" Dr. Valdez's expression was guarded. "I believe that you encountered something unusual, something that defies conventional explanation. Whether it's truly a creature of legend or something else entirely, I can't say, but I intend to find out." Her determination should have been reassuring, but instead it sent a chill down my spine. The memory of that thing's strength, its speed, its utter alienness, was still too fresh. "Be careful," I warned her. "This isn't some Bigfoot or Loch Ness monster. It's real, and it's lethal." She nodded solemnly. "I understand the risks, Mr. Romer, but if this creature is out there, we need to know more about it. For the safety of everyone in the area." I couldn't argue with her logic, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me that pursuing this thing would only lead to more tragedy. Still, I gave Dr. Valdez all the information I could, including the location of the strange marking I'd seen on the rock face. As the days turned into weeks, life in the small town near Chiricahua National Monument tried to return to normal. The park remained closed for routine maintenance, a flimsy excuse that fooled no one. Rumors flew thick and fast, each wilder than the last. Some said it was a government experiment gone wrong, others claimed it was aliens. A few even suggested it was some kind of demon, drawn to the area by ancient Native American rituals. I tried to put it all behind me, to forget what I'd seen and move on with my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The nightmares continued, becoming more vivid and terrifying with each passing night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of that inhuman shriek ringing in my ears. It was about a month after the incident when Dr. Valdez showed up at my door, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into my small apartment. "I've found something." She spread a collection of papers and photographs across my coffee table. Most were copies of old documents, their edges yellowed with age, but it was the photos that caught my attention. They showed cave paintings, ancient and weathered, depicting a creature that was hauntingly familiar. "These were discovered in a remote cave system about 50 miles from where you had your encounter," Dr. Valdez explained, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "They're at least 1,000 years old, possibly much older. And look at this." She pointed to a series of symbols next to one of the creature depictions. "These match the marking you saw on the rock face. It's some kind of written language, unlike anything I've ever seen before." I stared at the images, a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. "What does it mean?" Dr. Valdez shook her head. "I don't know, but I've been talking to some of the local tribal elders. They have stories, passed down through generations, of a time when these creatures walked the earth openly. They call them the Skin Stealers." Skin Stealers? The name sent a shiver down my spine. According to the legends, they could take on the appearance of their victims, wearing their skins like disguises. They were said to be nearly immortal, vulnerable only to very specific rituals and weapons. I thought back to the creature I'd encountered, its bizarre, almost patchwork appearance. But the thing I saw, it didn't look human at all. Dr. Valdez's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fascination and fear. "The elders say that over time, as belief in the old ways faded, the Skin Stealers began to lose their ability to perfectly mimic humans. They became twisted, monstrous versions of what they once were. But they're still out there, still hunting. I sat back, my mind reeling. So what do? We need to go back out there, Dr. Valdez said, her voice filled with determination. We need to find more evidence. Maybe even track this thing to its lair. If we can prove its existence, we can get the help we need to stop it. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to tell her she was crazy and show her the door. But deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever this thing was, it was still out there. And if the legends were true, it would keep killing, keep hunting, unless someone stopped it. When do we leave? I heard myself ask, even as a part of me wondered if I was signing my own death warrant. Dr. Valdez's relief was palpable. Tomorrow at dawn. I've got equipment, supplies, everything we'll need for an extended expedition. Are you sure you're up for this? I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. Someone has to stop this thing. Might as well be us. As Dr. Valdez left to make final preparations, I found myself staring out the window at the distant silhouette of the Chiricahua Mountains. Somewhere out there, a monster was waiting. A creature of myth and nightmare made flesh. Tomorrow we would venture into its domain, armed with little more than curiosity and desperation. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of blood red, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were embarking on a journey from which there might be no return. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cool as Dr. Valdez and I loaded the last of our gear into her rugged 4x4. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, the stars fading as the first hints of sunlight crept over the horizon. It would be scorching hot in a few hours, but for now the desert was peaceful, almost beautiful. We'd spent the night going over maps, checking equipment, and discussing strategy. Dr. Valdez had brought an impressive array of scientific instruments, cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recorders, even a device she claimed could detect unusual electromagnetic frequencies. I'd opted for more practical gear, extra water, first aid supplies, and a high-powered rifle I'd borrowed from a friend. The Glock was holstered at my hip, a comforting weight despite its proven ineffectiveness against our quarry. As we set out following rough jeep trails into the more remote areas of the park, an uneasy silence fell between us. The magnitude of what we were attempting, tracking a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist, weighed heavily on both our minds. You know, Dr. Valdez said as we bounced along a particularly rough stretch of trail. In all my years of studying cryptozoology, I never actually expected to find anything. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, they were always just stories, legends to be studied but never truly believed. I glanced over at her, noting the mix of excitement and fear in her eyes. And now, she shook her head, a rueful smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Now I'm not sure what to believe. If this creature is real, if it's truly what the legends say it is, it changes everything. Our understanding of history, of evolution, of what's possible in this world. I thought back to my encounter, to the sheer alienness of the creature I'd seen. Trust me, Doc, some things are better left as legends. We lapsed back into silence as the terrain grew more challenging. Eventually, we were forced to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot. The sun was high in the sky now, beating down mercilessly as we trudged through the rugged landscape. Despite the heat, I felt a constant chill, as if icy fingers were trailing down my spine. We'd been hiking for several hours, following the general direction of my previous encounter, when Dr. Valdez called for a break. As we sat in the meager shade of a large boulder, sipping water and catching our breath, she pulled out a small device that looked like a cross between a cell phone and a Geiger counter. I've been monitoring electromagnetic anomalies, she explained, fiddling with the controls. There's been a low-level disturbance all day, but it's getting stronger. We might be getting close to... As if on cue, a sound echoed through the canyon, a high, keening wail that set my teeth on edge. It was the same sound I'd heard just before the creature had fled during our last encounter. Dr. Valdez's eyes widened. Was that... Yeah. I cut her off, already on my feet. Rifle at the ready. That was it. We need to move, now. We quickened our pace, following the increasingly urgent beeping of Dr. Valdez's device. The sound came again, closer this time, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Every shadow, every rustle of wind through the scrub brush, seemed to hide potential danger. As we rounded a bend in the narrow canyon, we came upon a sight that stopped us dead in our tracks. There, carved into the sheer rock face, was an entrance. Not a natural cave, but something clearly artificial. Intricate symbols, similar to the ones we'd seen in the ancient cave paintings, surrounded the opening. "My God," Dr. Valdez breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. "This is it. This has to be where it lives." I raised my rifle, every muscle tense. Or where it takes its victims. The entrance loomed before us, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The air coming from within was cool and damp, carrying with it a faint, musty odor that reminded me uncomfortably of the creature's breath. Dr. Valdez fumbled with her pack, pulling out powerful flashlights for both of us. "We have to go in," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We might never get another chance like this." Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew she was right. Whatever answers we sought, whatever hope we had of stopping this thing, lay within the depths of that cave. With a deep breath to steel my nerves, I nodded. "Stay behind me. And if I say run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. Got it?" Dr. Valdez nodded solemnly. Together, we stepped into the darkness, the beam of our flashlights seeming pitifully inadequate against the oppressive gloom. The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The walls were smooth, almost polished, covered in more of those strange symbols. Dr. Valdez paused occasionally to take photos or readings, but I kept us moving, acutely aware of the potential danger lurking in every shadow. We had been descending for what felt like hours when the passage suddenly opened up into a vast chamber. Our flashlights couldn't penetrate to the far walls or ceiling, giving the impression of an endless void, but what we could see turned my blood to ice. The floor of the chamber was littered with bones. Hundreds, maybe thousands of skeletons, some ancient and yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh, and they weren't all human. Mixed in were the remains of creatures I couldn't identify, things with too many limbs, skulls that were decidedly not of this earth. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that truly defied comprehension. A pool of liquid black as night and perfectly still, reflected our flashlight beams like a dark mirror. And rising from its center was a structure that hurt to look at directly. It twisted and curved in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its surface constantly shifting and changing. As we stood there, frozen in awe and terror, a sound echoed through the chamber, that same high, keening wail we'd heard before. But this time, it was answered. From the depths of the pool, from the shadows at the edges of our vision, came a chorus of inhuman voices. We weren't alone, and whatever was in here with us, it knew we had arrived. The cacophony of alien wails reverberated through the chamber, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. I grabbed Dr. Valdez's arm, already backing towards the entrance. "We need to leave, now." But before we could make our escape, movement caught my eye. The surface of the black pool began to ripple and churn. Something was emerging. At first it looked like a hand reaching up from the depths, but as more of it breached the surface, I realized with mounting horror that it was nothing so mundane. It was a writhing mass of tentacles, each one easily as thick as my torso, covered in pulsating iridescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Oh my God," Dr. Valdez whispered, her voice barely audible over the continuing wails. It's beautiful." I tore my gaze away from the emerging monstrosity to look at her. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. The hand holding her camera was shaking violently, but she made no move to flee. "Elena," I shouted, shaking her roughly. "We have to go." She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. "What? Oh no." The thing in the pool was still rising, more and more of its impossible bulk becoming visible. It towered over us now, a shape that defied description, constantly shifting and reforming. Where I had expected to see a face, or at least eyes, there was only a swirling vortex of darkness. And then it spoke, not with words, not with any sound at all, but suddenly, horribly, its thoughts were in my head. "Intruders, witness, become." The force of it drove me to my knees. Images flooded my mind, vast cosmic vistas, worlds beyond imagination, creatures that dwarfed galaxies. I saw the birth and death of universes, the grand cycle of creation and destruction playing out on a scale I couldn't comprehend. And through it all, I sensed an ancient, alien intelligence. This thing, this entity, wasn't just old, it was timeless, eternal. It had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, had walked the earth when our ancestors were still single-celled organisms floating in primordial seas. I became aware of Dr. Valdez screaming, the sound seeming to come from very far away. With tremendous effort, I tore my gaze away from the entity and saw her on the ground, clutching her head, blood now flowing freely from her nose and ears. The strength of will it took to move was monumental, but somehow I managed to crawl to her side. "Elena," I gasped, my own head feeling like it was about to split open. "We have to get out of here." She looked at me, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Don't you see?" she babbled.
It's showing us everything. The truth about our world, about the universe. We're so small, Kevin, so insignificant.
I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "Stay with me, Doc. This thing, whatever it is, it's not here to enlighten us. It's going to kill us if we don't move." As if in response to my words, a new sound cut through the chaos, a wet, slithering noise that turned my stomach. I looked back towards the pool and immediately wished I hadn't. The smaller creatures I'd encountered before, the ones I'd started thinking of as the entity's servants or offspring, were emerging from the shadows. Dozens of them, their eyeless faces turned towards us, mouths opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. With strength born of desperation, I hauled Dr. Valdez to her feet. "Run," I shouted, giving her a push towards the entrance. She stumbled forward, seeming to finally grasp the danger we were in. We ran. Behind us, I could hear the slap of inhuman feet on stone, the scrape of claws, the hissing and shrieking of our pursuers. The narrow passageway that had taken us hours to descend now became a nightmarish gauntlet. I fired blindly behind us as we ran, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating twisted, monstrous forms. The bullets seemed to have little effect, but the noise and light at least seemed to slow them down. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, just when I was certain we couldn't outrun the horrors behind us for another second, I saw light ahead, the entrance to the cave. We burst out into the harsh sunlight of the desert, the sudden brightness momentarily blinding after the darkness of the cave. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in the shelter of a large rock formation. For long minutes we lay there, gasping for breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing. No inhuman shrieks, no slithering sounds. Just the wind whistling through the rocks and our own ragged breathing. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what we'd experienced settled over us like a shroud. Dr. Valdez began to sob quietly, her body shaking. I wasn't in much better shape, my mind reeling from the cosmic horrors we'd glimpsed. "What?" I finally managed to gasp out. "What the hell was that thing?" Dr. Valdez shook her head, her eyes haunted. "I don't know. I don't think human languages have words for what that was. An alien god? A being from another dimension? Does it even matter?" I thought back to the images that had flooded my mind, the sense of vast, incomprehensible age and power. "No," I said quietly. "I guess it doesn't." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We had sought answers, had wanted to uncover the truth behind the legends and the attacks. Now I wasn't sure if knowing the truth was better than the mystery we'd started with. We had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension, a reality so vast and alien that it threatened to shatter our understanding of the world. As darkness fell, we made our way back to Dr. Valdez's vehicle, moving slowly and carefully, jumping at every shadow. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd experienced. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of town that Dr. Valdez spoke. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, at a loss. "I don't know. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what could anyone do against that?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Maybe it's better if we don't say anything. At least not everything. We can report the cave, the symbols, but the rest, The rest stays with us. I finished for her. The thought of keeping quiet about what we'd seen didn't sit well with me, but I knew she was right. The truth would do more harm than good. The days that followed our expedition were a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. We stuck to our agreed-upon story. We'd found a cave with strange markings, possibly of archaeological significance, but had been forced to flee due to unstable conditions inside. We mentioned nothing of the entity in the pool, the cosmic visions, or the horde of creatures that had pursued us. The authorities seemed eager to accept our sanitized version of events. The cave was quickly cordoned off, with official statements citing concerns about structural instability and the need for further study. I couldn't help but wonder if someone somewhere knew more than they were letting on. Dr. Valdez threw herself into studying the photos and data we'd managed to collect before our hasty retreat. She spent hours poring over the images of the symbols, consulting with linguists and anthropologists, trying to decipher their meaning. I, on the other hand, found myself struggling to readjust to normal life. The mundane tasks of day-to-day existence seemed hollow, meaningless in the face of what I'd witnessed. How could I worry about paying bills or mowing the lawn when I knew that just miles away, an entity of unimaginable power slumbered beneath the earth? The nightmares, when they came, were vivid and terrifying. I would find myself back in that chamber, facing the rising horror from the pool, but in my dreams there was no escape. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the echoes of alien thoughts still reverberating through my mind. About a week after our return, Dr. Valdez called me, her voice tight with excitement. "I found something," she said. "Can you come over?" When I arrived at her small apartment, I found every surface covered in papers, books, and printouts. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "Look at this," she said, thrusting a stack of papers into my hands. "I've been comparing the symbols we found to known ancient scripts. There are similarities, hints of Sumerian cuneiform, elements of Proto-Elamite, but it's like nothing that's ever been documented." I flipped through the pages, my eyes glazing over at the complex diagrams and dense text. "What does it mean?" Dr. Valdez's expression grew serious. "I'm not sure, but based on what I've been able to decipher, I think those creatures, the ones we saw in the cave, they're not the real threat." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "They're guardians," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Protectors. They're there to keep something in, not out." The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. If those nightmarish creatures were merely guardians, what could they possibly be containing? The entity in the pool, or something even worse? As if reading my thoughts, Dr. Valdez continued. "The entity we saw, the one in the pool, I don't think it's fully awake yet. The symbols speak of a great awakening, a time when the sleeper shall rise and the veil between worlds shall be torn asunder." I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. "So what do we do?" Dr. Valdez shook her head, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't know, but we can't just sit back and do nothing. If this thing fully awakens, if it breaks free, I don't think our world would survive." As we sat there, surrounded by the fruits of Dr. Valdez's research, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in way over our heads. We were two people, a park ranger and a cryptozoologist, facing a threat of cosmic proportions. What chance did we have? But as I looked at Dr. Valdez, saw the resolve in her eyes, I knew we had to try. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, we couldn't let that thing awaken fully. The fate of our world, perhaps of reality itself, might depend on it. "Okay," I said, straightening up. "Where do we start?" Dr. Valdez smiled grimly. "We need to go back. There's more in those caves, more symbols to decipher, and we need to find a way to strengthen whatever's keeping that thing contained." The thought of returning to that place of nightmare sent a shudder through me, but I nodded. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow," she said, "at first light. And Kevin, thank you. I couldn't do this alone." As I left her apartment, the weight of our task settling heavily on my shoulders, I couldn't help but wonder, were we embarking on a noble quest to save the world, or were we merely hastening our own doom? Only time would tell. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cool as Dr. Valdez and I loaded our gear into her 4x4. This time, we were better prepared. In addition to the scientific equipment and weapons, we carried ancient texts, copies of the symbols we'd found, and talismans borrowed from local tribal elders who, after much persuasion, had shared some of their ancestral knowledge. The drive to the cave entrance was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The horrors we'd witnessed on our last expedition were still fresh in our minds, but the urgency of our mission drove us forward. As we approached the cave, I noticed something odd. The official barriers and warning signs that had been erected after our initial report were gone. In their place was nothing. No signs of human presence at all. "This isn't right," I muttered, hand moving to my holstered weapon. "There should be guards, researchers, something." Dr. Valdez nodded grimly. "I have a bad feeling about this." We cautiously approached the cave entrance, every sense on high alert. The symbols carved around the opening seemed to shimmer in the early morning light, almost as if they were alive. With a deep breath to steel our nerves, we switched on our flashlights and entered the cave. The descent seemed easier this time, the passage less steep and winding than I remembered, but that only added to my unease. It was as if the cave itself was inviting us in, eager for our return. As we reached the vast chamber where we'd encountered the entity, we froze in shock. The room had changed. The pool at the center was larger, its surface rippling with unseen currents. The bizarre structure rising from its depths had grown, its twisted form now nearly touching the ceiling of the cavern. But most disturbing of all were the new additions to the chamber. Crude altars had been erected around the pool, their surfaces stained dark with what I hoped wasn't blood. And there, tending to these altars, were people, ordinary-looking people in ordinary clothes. Their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes blank and unfocused. "My God," Dr. Valdez whispered. "They're in some kind of trance." As if hearing her words, the figures turned towards us. Their faces split into unnatural grins, revealing mouths full of sharpened teeth. And then they attacked. What followed was a nightmare of violence and horror. These weren't the inhuman creatures we'd faced before, but they were no less dangerous. They fought with inhuman strength and a complete disregard for their own safety. I fired my weapon, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but for every attacker that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Dr. Valdez fought beside me, wielding a makeshift flamethrower she'd constructed from a pressurized canister and a lighter. Just when it seemed we would be overwhelmed, a new sound cut through the chaos. A deep, resonant chant that seemed to come from the very walls of the cavern. The attackers froze, their faces contorting in pain, before collapsing to the ground. From the shadows emerged a group of figures in elaborate robes, their faces hidden behind intricately carved masks. One of them stepped forward, raising a gnarled staff. "You should not have returned," a voice rasped from behind the mask. "You have no idea what forces you are meddling with." Dr. Valdez stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "We know more than you think. The Sleeper, the Great Awakening. We've translated part of the symbols." The masked figure tilted its head, considering. "Perhaps you are not as ignorant as we feared, but your presence here has accelerated the awakening. The barriers between worlds grow thin." As if in response to his words, a tremor ran through the cavern. The surface of the pool began to churn, and a familiar alien pressure began to build in my mind. "It's happening," I gasped. "It's waking up." The masked figures began to chant again, their voices rising in an otherworldly harmony. The pressure in my head intensified, and I saw Dr. Valdez stumble, blood trickling from her nose. "We must act now," the lead figure said, turning to us. "The ritual to reinforce the barriers requires a sacrifice, a willing offering of life force." I looked at Dr. Valdez, saw the resolve in her eyes, and knew what I had to do. "I'll do it," I said, stepping forward. "Just tell me what I need to do." The masked figure nodded solemnly. "Your courage honors you. Step into the pool. Embrace the void. Your life force will strengthen the barriers, buying us more time." As I moved towards the roiling black liquid, Dr. Valdez grabbed my arm. "Kevin, no. There has to be another way." I smiled sadly at her. "You know there isn't. Someone has to do this, and your knowledge is too valuable. You need to continue the research, find a permanent solution." Tears streaming down her face. She nodded. I'll find a way to end this, I promise. With a final nod to her, I turned and stepped into the pool. The liquid was cold, so cold it burned. As I sank deeper, I felt something vast and alien brush against my mind. For a moment, I glimpsed the true nature of the entity we were fighting against, and my sanity nearly shattered. But then the chanting grew louder, and I felt my life force being drawn out, used to reinforce the barriers between worlds. As consciousness faded, my last thought was a hope that my sacrifice would be enough, that it would buy humanity the time it needed to find a way to stop this cosmic horror once and for all. Dr. Elena Valdez stood at the edge of Crater Lake, her eyes fixed on the placid blue waters that hid so many secrets. It had been 5 years since that fateful day in the cave. 5 years since Kevin Romer had sacrificed himself to keep an unimaginable horror at bay. In that time, she had dedicated every waking moment to unraveling the mystery of the entity, to finding a permanent solution to the threat it posed. Her research had taken her to the far corners of the globe, delving into ancient texts and forgotten lore. She had made progress, slowly but surely. The symbols were yielding their secrets, revealing a history far older and stranger than anyone had imagined. But the work was far from over. As she stood there lost in thought, a park ranger approached. Dr. Valdez, we're ready to begin the survey. She nodded, turning away from the lake. The young ranger looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out at him at any moment. Elena couldn't blame him. Those who knew the truth about what lay beneath Crater Lake rarely slept easy. Let's get started then, she said, forcing a smile. We have a lot of ground to cover. As they walked towards the waiting research team, Elena cast one last glance at the lake. Somewhere down there, in the cold, dark depths, an ancient evil slumbered, and somewhere in that same darkness was Kevin, his sacrifice buying them precious time. She silently renewed her vow to find a way to end this threat once and for all. For Kevin, for all those who had fallen victim to the entity, and for the future of humanity itself. The battle was far from over. But as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, there was hope. And in the face of cosmic horror, sometimes hope was all you had. My name is Connor Radcliffe, and the events I'm about to recount occurred during the summer of 2004. At the time, I was 19 years old, working as a counselor at Camp Silver Lake in Pennsylvania. The decision to take this position was driven by a desire to distance myself from my parents' constant pressuring and to earn money for my impending college education. Camp Silver Lake was situated in a picturesque location, surrounded by dense forests and centered around a pristine lake. The main lodge, a large wooden structure, served as the hub of camp activities. Surrounding it were numerous cabins for campers and staff, as well as various activity areas for sports, crafts, and outdoor pursuits. Upon my arrival at the camp, I was struck by the serene atmosphere. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the sounds of nature. It was a stark contrast to the urban environment I had left behind, and I found myself looking forward to the summer ahead. The week before the campers' arrival was dedicated to staff orientation and preparation. It was during this time that I became acquainted with my fellow counselors. There was Evan, an athletic individual with a penchant for organizing physical activities and a seemingly boundless energy for long-distance running. Cassidy was our resident artist, always eager to engage in creative projects and share her passion for arts and crafts. Maddie, a longtime camp attendee turned counselor, naturally assumed a leadership role among us. As I was unpacking my belongings in one of the staff cabins, Maddie entered, clipboard in hand. Her demeanor was professional and focused, a testament to her experience with the camp's operations. "Connor," she said, her tone businesslike, "you're assigned to kitchen duty this evening. Please ensure everything runs smoothly." I nodded in acknowledgement, attempting to inject some levity into the conversation. "I'll do my best not to burn down the camp. If I do, we can always blame it on the legendary ghost of Silver Lake." Maddie's serious expression softened slightly, and she allowed herself a small chuckle. "I'm sure the campers would find that entertaining. Just focus on your responsibilities, please." As Maddie left, I returned to my unpacking, my mind wandering to the summer ahead. Little did I know that my joke about camp ghosts would prove to be unnervingly prescient. The subsequent days were filled with preparation activities. We cleaned and organized the cabins, checked the safety equipment, and planned the summer's activities. The atmosphere among the staff was one of anticipation and excitement. When the campers arrived, the camp burst into life. The air filled with the sounds of laughter, splashing water, and the general commotion of children enjoying their summer adventure. I was assigned to oversee Cabin 6, housing a group of boys aged 12 to 13. They were an energetic bunch, full of enthusiasm for the camp activities. However, one camper in particular, Jameson, proved to be a challenge. He had a habit of sneaking out after lights out, necessitating frequent retrieval missions on my part. Each time, I would remind him of the potential dangers lurking in the surrounding woods, emphasizing the ease with which one could become lost in the dense forest. As the first week progressed, we settled into a routine of activities: hiking, swimming, crafts, and campfire gatherings. The days were long and tiring, but there was a sense of fulfillment in guiding the campers through their experiences. It was during this time that I began to notice subtle changes in the camp's atmosphere. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A unexplained rustle in the bushes, a shadow glimpsed from the corner of my eye. But as the days wore on, these occurrences became more frequent, and a sense of unease began to permeate the camp. Little did we know that these small disturbances were merely the prelude to the terrifying events that would soon unfold, forever changing our lives and the history of Camp Silver Lake. The weekend marking the end of our first week at Camp Silver Lake began like any other. The air was filled with the excited chatter of campers anticipating a day of activities. However, as the staff gathered for our morning meeting, an unsettling realization dawned upon us. Maddie was absent. Initially, we attributed her absence to ordinary causes. Perhaps she had overslept, or decided to take an early morning swim in the lake. However, as the hours passed with no sign of her, our concern grew exponentially. Evan, ever the proactive individual, took charge of the situation. "All right, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying a mixture of authority and concern. "We need to organize a search. We'll divide into pairs and cover every inch of this camp. Check the cabins, the lake, and the surrounding woods. Leave no stone unturned." I was paired with Cassidy for the search. As we ventured into the dense forest surrounding the camp, an eerie silence enveloped us. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, adding to the growing sense of unease. "Maddie," we called out repeatedly, our voices echoing through the trees. The lack of response was disconcerting. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the underbrush became thicker, scratching at our legs and snagging our clothing. The canopy overhead grew denser, casting deep shadows across our path. It was in one of these shadowy areas that we made a chilling discovery. Lying on the ground, partially obscured by fallen leaves, was Maddie's clipboard. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Maddie was known for her meticulous nature. The idea of her carelessly discarding her clipboard was inconceivable. Cassidy's face paled as she knelt to retrieve the clipboard. "This isn't good, Connor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maddie wouldn't just leave this behind." I nodded in agreement, a knot forming in my stomach. "Let's head back and report this to the others. Maybe they've found something more." As we made our way back to the camp, the forest seemed to close in around us. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf set our nerves on edge. The camp, which had always felt like a safe haven, now seemed vulnerable and exposed. Upon our return, we gathered with the other counselors at the main lodge. The atmosphere was tense as each pair reported their findings, or lack thereof. No one had seen any sign of Maddie beyond the clipboard we had discovered. Evan, his usual confidence somewhat shaken, made the decision we all knew was necessary. "We need to contact the authorities," he stated firmly. "This is beyond our capabilities to handle." The arrival of the police brought a new level of gravity to the situation. As they took our statements and began their own search, the reality of Maddie's disappearance began to sink in. The campers, sensing the adult's distress, became anxious and fearful. For days, the police scoured the area, utilizing search dogs and even a helicopter. But as the search wore on with no results, a sense of hopelessness began to set in. After a week of fruitless searching, the police were forced to scale back their efforts, leaving us with more questions than answers. In the wake of the police departure, we attempted to restore some semblance of normalcy to the camp. Activities resumed, but there was an undercurrent of tension that permeated every aspect of camp life. Every unexpected sound, every shadow, seemed to hold the potential for danger. It was against this backdrop of fear and uncertainty that the next shocking event occurred. One night, during my routine bed check, I discovered Jameson's bunk empty. The realization that another person had vanished hit me like a physical blow. With a sense of dread, I roused Evan and Cassidy, and we embarked on another search. As we ventured into the woods, calling Jameson's name, the darkness seemed to press in around us, filled with unseen threats. It was then that I noticed a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the dense foliage.
"Oh, look," I said, pointing towards the light. "Over there!"
As we approached, we realized the light was coming from a dilapidated cabin, one that was not marked on any of the camp maps. The structure looked ancient, its wood weathered and warped by years of exposure. With trepidation, we entered the cabin. The sight that greeted us was horrifying. Jameson lay unconscious on the floor, bound with rope. The room was filled with strange symbols drawn on the walls and floor, their meanings unknown but undeniably sinister. As we rushed to untie Jameson and carry him to safety, a chilling realization settled over us. The events unfolding at Camp Silver Lake were far more terrifying than we could have imagined, and we were caught in the middle of a nightmare that was only beginning to unfold. The discovery of Jameson in the mysterious cabin marked a turning point in the unfolding events at Camp Silver Lake. Upon our return to the camp with the unconscious boy, we immediately contacted the authorities. The police response this time was swift and decisive, a stark contrast to the gradual wind down of the search for Maddie. As Jameson was rushed to the hospital, the camp became a hive of activity. Police officers combed the grounds, forensic teams descended on the cabin in the woods, and anxious parents began arriving to collect their children. The camp director, in consultation with the authorities, made the difficult decision to shut down operations for the summer. In the midst of this chaos, I found myself unable to simply walk away. The mysteries surrounding Maddie's disappearance and Jameson's abduction gnawed at me, demanding resolution. Evan and Cassidy, it turned out, felt the same way. As the last of the campers departed, we approached the camp director with a proposal to stay on and assist with the investigation. "I understand your concern," the director said, his face etched with worry lines, "but this is a matter for the professionals. It could be dangerous." "With all due respect, sir," I countered, "we know this camp better than anyone. We can provide valuable assistance to the investigation." After some deliberation, and with the cautious approval of the lead detective, we were allowed to stay. The once bustling camp now felt eerily empty, its silence broken only by the activities of the investigating officers. Our first order of business was to revisit the cabin where we had found Jameson. In the light of day, its ominous aura was somewhat diminished, but the sense of wrongness lingered. The police had finished their initial examination, but allowed us to look around under supervision. "What do you make of these symbols?" Cassidy asked, gesturing to the strange markings on the walls. Evan shook his head. "I've never seen anything like them. They don't look like any language I know." As we examined the cabin, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The symbols, while unfamiliar, seemed to be arranged in patterns. Some appeared repeatedly, while others were unique. It was clear that whoever had created them was following some sort of system or ritual. In one corner, we discovered a pile of personal effects. Among them was a backpack that we recognized as belonging to Maddie. The sight of it sent a chill through me. Whatever had happened to her, this cabin was undoubtedly connected. Over the next few days, we threw ourselves into the investigation. We pored over maps of the area, searching for any other structures or locations that might have escaped notice. We interviewed camp staff who had worked previous summers, hoping to uncover any strange occurrences or legends that might provide clues. One evening, as we sat in the main lodge reviewing our findings, Evan made a startling connection. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an old camp ledger. "There have been other disappearances over the years. They're not frequent, but every decade or so, someone goes missing from the camp or the surrounding area." This revelation added a new dimension to our investigation. Whatever was happening at Camp Silver Lake, it had roots that stretched back far longer than we had initially believed. As we delved deeper into the camp's history, we began to uncover whispers of local legends. Stories of strange lights in the woods, of eerie sounds echoing across the lake at night, of hikers who ventured into the forest and never returned. These tales had always been dismissed as campfire stories, but in light of recent events, they took on a more sinister significance. Our breakthrough came when we received word that Jameson had regained consciousness in the hospital. The detective assigned to the case allowed us to accompany him for the interview, recognizing that a familiar face might help put the boy at ease. Jameson's account was fragmented and confused, but one detail stood out with chilling clarity. He spoke of a man with a distinctive scar on his face, a man who had taken him from his bed and brought him to the cabin in the woods. He kept talking about a ritual, Jameson said, his voice trembling. Said he needed to complete the circle, whatever that means. As we left the hospital, the weight of this new information settled heavily upon us. We now had a face to associate with the horrors unfolding at Camp Silver Lake. The face of a scarred man, driven by some incomprehensible purpose. That night, as I lay in my bunk unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of uncovering something far larger and more terrifying than we had initially imagined. The scarred man, the strange symbols, the history of disappearances, all pointed to a dark secret that had been festering in these woods for generations. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were plagued by visions of shadowy figures moving through the trees, of strange symbols glowing in the dark, and of a scarred face grinning with malevolent purpose. Little did I know that these nightmares were but a pale shadow of the horrors that awaited us in the coming days. Armed with the information from Jameson and our own research into the camp's history, we decided to take a more proactive approach in our investigation. After consulting with the lead detective, we formulated a plan to conduct nightly stakeouts around the camp, focusing particularly on the area near the mysterious cabin. We divided the night into shifts, each of us taking turns to watch for any unusual activity. The police provided us with walkie-talkies to maintain communication, and we were under strict instructions to alert them immediately if we spotted anything suspicious. The first few nights of our stakeout passed uneventfully. The forest was quiet, save for the usual nocturnal sounds of wildlife. However, the lack of activity did little to ease the tension that had settled over us. If anything, the waiting only served to heighten our anxiety. It was on the fourth night of our vigil that things took a dramatic turn. I was on watch with Cassidy, positioned near the edge of the camp overlooking the path that led to the cabin. The night was unusually still, with a thin mist clinging to the ground, obscuring the forest floor. As midnight approached, a sound caught my attention, a faint rustling, distinct from the ambient noises of the forest. I signaled to Cassidy, and we both peered intently into the darkness. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shadow seemed to be moving through the trees, more fluid than any animal I had ever seen. As it drew closer, the shadow resolved into a human figure. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The figure was tall and lean, moving with an unnatural grace through the undergrowth. But it was the face that sent a chill down my spine. Even in the dim moonlight, I could make out the distinctive scar that Jameson had described. "It's him," I whispered to Cassidy, my hand shaking as I reached for the walkie-talkie. The scarred man. Before I could radio for backup, the figure stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he had spotted us. But then I realized he was carrying something, or someone, over his shoulder. "He's got another victim," Cassidy hissed, her voice tight with fear and anger. I quickly relayed our position and what we had seen to Evan and the police. Then, driven by a mixture of adrenaline and a desperate need to prevent another tragedy, we made the decision to follow the scarred man. Moving as quietly as we could, we trailed the figure through the woods. The mist made it difficult to keep sight of him, and more than once we nearly lost his trail. But somehow we managed to keep pace. After what seemed like an eternity of tense pursuit, the scarred man came to a stop in a small clearing. As he lowered his burden to the ground, I recognized the unconscious form of Steve, another counselor who had stayed behind to assist with the investigation. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. We were unarmed, save for my pocket knife, Evan's baseball bat, and Cassidy's heavy-duty flashlight. The police were on their way, but I knew we couldn't wait for them to arrive. Every second counted. With a silent nod to my companions, we spread out to surround the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept forward, acutely aware of every twig and leaf beneath my feet. The scarred man seemed preoccupied with his unconscious captive, giving us a momentary advantage. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I made my move. In one swift motion, I pressed my pocket knife against the man's back, my voice low and steady as I spoke. "Don't move." The scarred man froze, his body tensing at the sudden threat. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, sending chills down my spine. "You don't know what you're getting into." Evan stepped forward, his baseball bat at the ready. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man's response was chilling in its calm delivery. "Names don't matter. What matters is that you've interfered with something much bigger than you can comprehend." Cassidy, her flashlight gripped tightly, interjected with barely contained anger. "You're just a psychopath. This ends now." What happened next occurred with frightening speed. The scarred man moved with inhuman quickness, his elbow connecting with my stomach and knocking the wind out of me. Evan swung his bat, but the man ducked, wrenching the weapon from his grasp. Cassidy, reacting quickly, swung her flashlight. The heavy object connected with the man's head, causing him to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, I tackled him to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, his strength far exceeding what his lean frame suggested. Through sheer determination and the advantage of numbers, we managed to subdue him. Evan and Cassidy quickly bound his hands and feet with rope we had brought for our stakeout. As we caught our breath, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The police had arrived, drawn by our earlier radio call. The scarred man was taken into custody, and paramedics tended to the still unconscious Steve. In the days that followed, we hoped for answers. However, the scarred man remained stubbornly silent, refusing to divulge any information about his motives or the whereabouts of Maddie. The police investigation continued, but without further leads, it eventually stalled. The camp never reopened, the events of that summer casting a long shadow over its once idyllic reputation. For those of us who had lived through the ordeal, the scars ran deep, both physical and emotional. In the weeks and months following the capture of the scarred man, life took on a surreal quality. The events at Camp Silver Lake had shaken us to our core, leaving us grappling with questions that seemed to have no answers. The authorities conducted a thorough investigation, combing through every inch of the camp and the surrounding forest. Despite their efforts, no trace of Maddie was ever found. The symbols in the cabin were analyzed by experts, but their meaning remained elusive, adding another layer of mystery to the already perplexing case. The scarred man, identified through fingerprints as Jared Blackwood, had no prior criminal record. His background check revealed a disturbingly normal life up until a few years before the incidents at the camp. What had triggered his descent into madness and violence remained unclear. As summer faded into fall, we each tried to come to terms with what had happened in our own ways. I found myself plagued by nightmares, reliving the terrifying moments in the forest clearing. The sound of rustling leaves or an unexpected shadow was enough to send my heart racing. Evan threw himself into physical activities with even greater fervor than before, as if trying to outrun the memories. Cassidy turned to her art, producing dark, unsettling pieces that seemed to capture the essence of our shared trauma. We stayed in touch, bound by the experiences we had shared. Our conversations often circled back to that summer, each of us trying to make sense of what had happened. The unanswered questions gnawed at us, particularly the fate of Maddie and the true nature of Blackwood's motivations. As time passed, we gradually began to rebuild our lives. I enrolled in college as planned, though my chosen field of study shifted to psychology, driven by a desire to understand the human mind and perhaps gain some insight into the events we had experienced. 5 years after the events at Camp Silver Lake, I found myself back in the area, drawn by a mix of nostalgia and an unresolved need for closure. The camp itself remained abandoned, its buildings slowly reclaimed by nature. As I stood at the edge of the property, memories flooded back with startling clarity. The laughter of children, the crackling of campfires, the sense of camaraderie among the staff, all overshadowed by the terror that had unfolded here. During my visit, I met with local authorities to inquire about any developments in the case. While there had been no breakthroughs, they shared some unsettling information. Over the years, there had been sporadic reports of strange sightings in the woods surrounding the former camp. Glimpses of shadowy figures, unexplained lights, and eerie sounds echoing through the trees. These reports, while unsubstantiated, sent a chill down my spine. They hinted at the possibility that whatever dark forces had been at work during that fateful summer might still be active, lurking just beyond the edge of civilization. A decade after the Camp Silver Lake incident, Evan, Cassidy, and I reunited for a weekend getaway. As we sat around a campfire, notably far from any dense forests, the conversation inevitably turned to the events of that summer. Evan, now a physical education teacher, spoke of his ongoing struggles with hypervigilance. "I can't shake the feeling of being watched," he admitted, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond our circle of light. Cassidy, who had become a successful artist known for her evocative and slightly disturbing works, nodded in understanding. "I see his face sometimes," she said quietly. "The scarred man. In crowds, in my dreams. I know it's not real, but..." As we talked, we realized that each of us had been drawn to careers and lifestyles that in some way reflected our experiences. My work in psychology, Evan's focus on physical preparedness, Cassidy's exploration of darkness through art, all were in their own ways attempts to process and understand what we had been through. It was during this reunion that we made a startling discovery. In discussing our individual research into the history of the area, we found that the pattern of disappearances and strange occurrences stretched back much further than we had initially realized. Generations of locals had whispered about the curse of Silver Lake, a legend we had dismissed as campfire stories but now took on a more ominous significance. As our weekend came to a close, we made a pact. We would continue to investigate, to seek answers to the questions that had haunted us for so long. Not out of a desire for adventure or closure, but out of a sense of responsibility to those who had been lost, and to prevent future tragedies. In the years that followed, we maintained our connection, sharing any new information we uncovered. We created a network of contacts, local historians, paranormal researchers, and even a few sympathetic law enforcement officers, all dedicated to unraveling the mysteries surrounding Camp Silver Lake. While we never fully solved the puzzle, our efforts were not in vain. Our vigilance and willingness to speak out about our experiences led to increased awareness and safety measures in wilderness areas across the region. The legend of the scarred man became a cautionary tale, reminding people to remain alert and prepared in the great outdoors. As I reflect on the events of that summer and the journey it set us on, I am struck by the resilience of the human spirit. We faced unimaginable horrors, yet we emerged not broken, but determined. The scars remain, both physical and emotional, but they serve as a reminder of our strength and the bonds forged in adversity. The mystery of Camp Silver Lake may never be fully resolved, but in our continued quest for answers, we honor the memory of those lost and stand guard against the darkness that lurks at the edges of our world. For in the face of the unknown, vigilance is not just a choice, but a responsibility we all share.